Good evening, friends, and happy fifth night of Hanukkah, everybody. My name is David Weisberg. I am the CEO of the Federation for Jewish Philanthropy of Upper Fairfield County, and we have a wonderful Hanukkah gift for all of you tonight. What better than a really, I think, interesting and moving and fun conversation we're going to have tonight with Bess Kalb and Dale Atkins, and I'm so grateful that we have the opportunity to share it with all of you. It's so fun to see our list of attendees growing and growing as this program is starting. We have people registered not only from Connecticut and New York, but I saw someone from Wisconsin, a few people from California. So it's so wonderful to have all of you with us tonight for this very special program. I'm really grateful for our partners. This is not something our federation is doing alone. We have wonderful partners in UJA, JCC, Greenwich, who I'll talk more about in a moment, the Westport Library, and the wonderful folks at the Jewish Book Council who help make all of this possible. I'm especially pleased to be partnering with our friends at the Jewish Federation in Greenwich. This year has been not only a very challenging one, but one where I've really been inspired by the way our Jewish federations have stepped forward, not only with wonderful virtual programming like we're having tonight, but to support our extended Jewish family, both here at home and around the world. And I know for our federation and for our friends in Greenwich, that's included things like personal protective equipment for our frontline workers. It's included things like the fight against food insecurity and things that we're doing together to support our extended Jewish family in Israel. Just in the past few months, our neighbors in Greenwich and our federation and our other neighboring federations in southern New England joined together to buy a piece of medical equipment called an air seal, which is saving lives at Emek Medical Center in Afula. And just today, as a result of the civil war that's going on in Ethiopia, Israel has accelerated bringing the rest of the Ethiopian Jewish community to Israel, and the absorption centers are filled there. And we got a call that the Beit Alpha Absorption Center in Afula, our partnership community, needed laptops for young Ethiopian children who are distance learning just like everyone else, and was so grateful that we could come together to buy laptops for Ethiopian children who have just moved to Israel. And so those are some of the things, in addition to programs like this, that our federations are doing to make a real difference right now. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. If you haven't already purchased Bess Kalb's book, we know you're going to want to do that. We're going to post the link a couple times of the best place to do that. The place that we're recommending is on the penguinrandomhouse.com website. And we're going to share that link throughout the program in the chat so that you all know how to do that. And the second thing is that at the end of Bess and Dale's conversation, we're going to have an opportunity for you to ask questions. I'll be back to help moderate that. And there'll be two ways to ask questions. One is to simply type your question into the chat feature, and I'd ask that you let us know where you're writing from. The second, and it's a fun one, is if you want to raise your virtual hand, we can bring you live into the conversation. What that means is if your camera is on, you'll be live on screen for everyone to see you. So just a heads up if you've changed in your pajamas a little bit early tonight. We don't want to catch anybody off guard. So I don't want to stand in the way of moving forward with this program. I want to introduce not only my colleague, the director of the Federation in Greenwich, but my friend as well. And so I'm pleased to invite onto the screen my friend Pam Ehrenkrantz.
Hi. Hi, everybody. Thank you, David. It's always such a pleasure to co-sponsor with you. We're pleased to be co-sponsoring with the Westport Library and to work with you and Stacy, also a privilege. My job is to introduce Dale Atkins and Bess Kalb. We'll start with Dale. Dale Atkins is a licensed psychologist with more than 40 years of experience as a relationship expert, focusing on families, wellness, managing stress, and living a balanced, meaningful life. She is the author of 7 books and many chapters, articles, and journals for both popular and professional audiences. Dale has appeared regularly on NBC's Today and CNN. Dale has a private psychology practice in New York City. She has 2 children, 6 grandchildren, and lives in Connecticut. Bess Kalb is an Emmy-nominated writer for Jimmy Kimmel Live. Her writing for the show earned her a Writers Guild Award in 2016. She's also written for the Oscars and the Emmys. She's a regular contributor to the New Yorker's Daily Shouts, and her work has been published in the New Republic, Grantland, Salon.com, Wired, The Nation, and elsewhere. She lives in Los Angeles. We are unbelievably excited to hear about her new book, Nobody Will Tell You This But Me, and to have her in conversation with such an esteemed psychologist and well-loved community member. Over to you guys.
Hello, Dale. Hi. What an honor to be here. Oh, I think you're still muted.
Hi, Bess. I thought I clicked the right place.
The joys of Zoom.
The joys of Zoom. I'm so glad to be here with you on your non-traditional book tour. I know you went into quarantine as soon as your book was released, so that's got to be a first. And despite that, you have reached so many people, and so many people have been unbelievably touched by your words, by your sentiments. And just so you know, when I first picked up your book for my book group last spring, I was unable to get past the 3rd page because my mom had recently died. And I felt I was reading her words, listening to her voicemails, which I also kept and listened to. And it was just too much. So when Pam called and asked months later if I would interview you, I wasn't sure I'd be able to. And I am so grateful to you personally and professionally for writing this magnificent, wonderful memoir. And I'm really looking forward to talking with you about it. Thank you for sharing your time. There's so much on your plate. I laughed, I cried. I appreciated the unique way you tell your grandmother's story, which I'm going to ask you to really go into in a while. There's sorrow, there's joy, it's a story of survival. It's a story of determination. It's a story with humor and grace and perseverance. And reading it through the pandemic really seemed very right because it was so inspirational. And these are all qualities we need. So before I ask you my first question, Bess, I understand this is actually the 2nd book that you wrote about your grandmother. The first one was when you were 8 years old, is that correct?
That's right. And first of all, Dale, I'd just like to say, I would like you to come on every single one of these with me. I was like, yeah, I guess I wrote a book about my grandma. When you had the way that you beautifully, I just really want to thank you for your reflection and taking it in the way you did. And you know, my hope in writing this was that it would resonate with somebody as deeply as it seemed to resonate with you. And so it's so fulfilling as a writer, but also as a granddaughter and somebody who is just trying to reach other women and other people who have a matriarch in their family that they feel connected to beyond life. And so this is what a kismet pairing this is that it really
Thank you. Well, I will, you know, sometimes these things happen with props. Here's mine.
Sure.
Just in case. I mean, you're a comedy writer, but let me tell you something. This really tears at your heartstrings, and we'll talk about that too.
Sure, of course.
When you were 8, you were supposed to write a story about a fascinating person from history.
Yes.
And so why don't you tell us who you wrote about at age 8, if you don't mind?
Sure.
And then we'll move on to what you wrote recently.
You know, this feels set up, and it's not. Dale did not tell me this.
No, I did not.
Right now, where I wrote the book, on my bookshelf, I have a copy of the book, which
Right.
I've never done this in an event. I can bring it over to you right now if you'd like to see the life story
Please
of
do.
Otis Bell. And here's a never before seen dramatic moment. Okay, here it is. It's right at my bookshelf.
Oh my God.
I mean, I couldn't have, believe me, I'm not a good enough, set piece, prop comedian to plan that one. But here it is. There are actually a few family pictures tucked away in it. This is called The Life Story of Barbara Otis Bell by Bess Kalb. I signed it like John Hancock. I guess I had just learned cursive. Heathcote Publishing Center, April 1996, grade 3, Mrs. Citron, from Scarsdale, New York. Heathcote School. We played Greenwich in soccer pretty frequently, and we always lost. So good for you. But yeah, this is the first draft, I guess, of this. So here's if you want to see a book's complete evolution in one Zoom frame, here you go. And really it was a misunderstanding of an assignment, but also a great example of just how brainwashed I was by my grandmother. The assignment was to write about a historical figure you admired. And who am I going to write about but the woman who tells me her history constantly? The stories of, there's the story, for those of you who have read the book, you'll probably recognize these. And I should actually talk to Penguin Random House Legal to see. I mean,
we won't tell them. Just
I plagiarized myself. Here's the story of Georgie and Leo, the two twins.
Yes.
Who swapped places, giving my grandmother a hell of a time. I have stories about.
So Bess, wait a minute. Let me just hold you back a minute. For those people who haven't read it and don't know about the twins, who were your mother's brothers, tell us a little bit first. Set the stage for us, because not everyone on the call has read your beautiful book, and I hope by the end of the evening everybody's going to order it. But you did something with this incredible intergenerational family memoir, I think. You spoke in the voice of your truly unforgettable grandmother. And you did it in a way to feel closer to her, to help process your grief after her death. And just tell us how that happened, and then go back to the twins and those stories, if you don't mind.
Sure. And then after this, I assume you're going to bill me and it'll go through insurance. Because this is Dr. Atkins is now in the Zoom. But yes, this was a way to process my grief. And I don't necessarily recommend it as a grief coping tool. But I wrote this book out of just a sheer emotional reaction to missing my grandmother after her funeral. This book started as a eulogy that I actually delivered at her funeral in Massachusetts, where I was tasked with delivering a speech at a funeral, like many granddaughters have before me. And unfortunately, I was all in my head about it as a writer, and I was so close with my grandmother. She and I really were best friends. Her loss was really cataclysmic for me. And I was having a lot of trouble putting into words. She was a mother and a grandmother, a beloved member of the community. I found they were falling short. And so I turned to my husband. I woke him up at 2 a.m. the night before the funeral. And I said, Charlie, would it be in poor taste if I did the eulogy as grandma? And he was like, potentially. What are you talking about? And I was like, just trust me. I've got this. And I got up there in front of my grieving relatives, and I read one of her voicemails, a voicemail that's in the book. And like many Jewish grandmothers, my grandmother would let me have it in voicemails. This was an audience of 0. She could just speak into the voicemail box and say what she wanted to say. And in this particular voicemail that I sort of interpreted and gave a longer version of, it was the story of her taking me to nursery school every day when I was 4 years old. And it was a sweet story, a story about sacrifice, about our strong connection, and about my dependency on her. And it ended with her turning the knife and saying, move back to New York by the end of the year. There's always an agenda. And I did that in her voice. And basically, Dale, my relatives were laughing at this painful moment in their lives when they missed her. And it's because I was able to channel her for that audience. I knew I really, really had her voice and was able to bring her back. And so my grief and my processing became writing as her and just telling her stories to me as her. That's a slip, but it truly is the fact that her stories became my stories. And in writing them, I found myself healing.
I think that it's so important what you just said, that her stories became your stories, because one of the questions I really have for you is as a storyteller. I mean, you talk about your grandmother as a phenomenal storyteller, and you obviously are a great storyteller. And I'd like you to unpack, if you will, for us, why is it important for families. I mean, you showed the picture of your young uncles, but your uncles when they were young, because
Yeah.
you didn't know them. And you also didn't know her mother.
No.
And yet, through her stories, she shared with you who these people were, but the messages were filled with meaning. So
Yeah.
you got to know, it seemed to me, you got to know these people through their personalities, through their character, through their own grit, through their own perseverance, through their wily ways. And maybe you'll tell the story about the switching brothers with the law school exam. But they became part of you. You never met these people, yet you know where you're from, and you have this grit. And I think that talking about that and giving people maybe advice for why it's important to keep those family stories going.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind doing that.
Oh, of course. No, I mean, I think that really is the takeaway from the book. It's that the stories are what keep us alive. The stories are the memories that live on. You know, the idea of my grandmother's life being a book is initially very unlikely. This was not a woman who discovered a vaccine or was a great figure of history or a woman who ever really had a newspaper article written about her. This was just an ordinary mother and housewife and grandmother, yet the stories that she told were epic. And they were these fantastical tales of survival and perseverance. And of course, she was always the hero in them, but there was this sense of Odyssean, love and drama that came out of them. This was my grandmother's life story, is the story of someone who was born penniless on a dining room table in a tenement in Brooklyn and died in a Palm Beach penthouse overlooking the ocean. And in that arc contains her history of her mother and the suffering of the shtetl and the suffering of the pogroms, and it includes the American dream and sacrifice for her children and a tough relationship with her daughter. There are these stories contained in her life that are so much bigger than just what the description of her life would be in an obituary. They really were the stuff of legend. And so in committing that to paper and in basically being a dutiful granddaughter who was the recipient of her stories her whole life. I mean, my grandma, we would be driving in the car and she would tell me the story of the twin switcheroo. And in brief, that story is my grandmother's older brothers were identical twins, and one of them got very, very sick while he was in his last year of law school. And the other brother, who was a drunk, always on the picket line, just like my grandmother's father, said, "Okay, I will finish your law degree for you." And his legal scholar brother was too weak to fight back. Their names were Georgie and Leo. Leo, the lawyer, was sick. Georgie, the rapscallion, and Georgie went to his law school, signed his brother's name in the ledger, sat for every lecture, took the final exams, and then miraculously passed the New York State bar, which Kennedy failed, passed the New York State bar as his brother. And then, nobody was the wiser in the family except for my grandmother and his twin. And so these are the kinds of sort of figures that came alive for me as a child, because they were just referred to as if they were people in the room. Leo would hate that. Oh, Georgie would have the best joke about that. My grandmother would just bring them up as if they were there. And for her, they really were. And then for me, they were as well. And so I'm trying to do that to her. I'm trying to pay that forward. The way that she was able to animate the dead with her stories and animate the loved ones that she lost with her tales of their life. I committed her to this book so that she could live on for other people. And so how gratifying it is for me, and probably for her, for her memory to know, and certainly for my grandfather to know, that there are people who are laughing along with her and seeing Bobby as this character in their lives. It's her final act.
And you raised your grandfather, and I was so touched when you were channeling your grandmother and talking about her death and what it was like, what she felt it was like when people were putting dirt on the coffin. And I don't know how you did this, and people were laughing while you were doing this, but it was, and you saw him.
That part I didn't read.
Oh, okay. You saw him transform with just being able to hear her voice.
Yeah.
And I think that that's also another piece of this, that somehow talking in her voice is an unbelievable act of empathy and compassion to help people who are grieving, in addition to yourself, be able to grieve fully. Because you spoke about your grandmother with all of her flaws and all of her magnificence, and she was a person who was a force to be contended with. And I really also want to ask you, she referred to you as your friend, her friend, and you were her friend. She took you to museums, she took you to restaurants. You said something which really stuck with me. You said you were along for her ride.
Yeah.
Will you tell us a little bit about that? Because she was taking care of you when you were a very little girl. You weren't baking cookies together. You know, you were going to the Met. So tell us a little bit about her ride and why you were her chosen companion.
You know, I think that really is the crux of our relationship, and that passage in the book, it really does sort of nail our dynamic, and certainly what she saw in me, which, by the way, was all projection. She put this on me when I was a neonate, when I was a day old, and she looked at me and looked at her daughter in the hospital bed who had just given birth, and for those of you who haven't read the book, my grandmother had a very tough relationship with my mom, with her daughter, looked at me and saw this as a do-over. And so I happened to look exactly like my mother. And for my grandmother, this was all a sort of a chance to have this relationship with the daughter that she tried desperately to have, but never really could. And so our relationship, you know, as much as that instinct came out, this wasn't a doting grandmother. This wasn't, I'll sit there and watch you on the swings. Her way of doing that was to just indoctrinate me. You know, her daughter was, you know, her daughter wasn't into shopping at Bloomingdale's or, you know, fancy lunches. My mom bought all her clothes at the Army Navy store and grew her hair out. Down her back was this Vietnam protesting hippie feminist, and, you know, my hero in so many ways. But here I was, this little girl in this apartment in Manhattan with these, you know, two parents who, you know, for them a luxury was like, you know, going to Jackson Hole, the diner on 84th and Amsterdam, and I would get fries all to myself. And my grandmother whisked me off to the plaza. And so as this wide-eyed little girl who would stand there in a Laura Ashley printed dress at the door to my parents' apartment for an hour before my grandma arrived, like a dog whose owner just left, I would literally just stand there waiting for my grandma to get there. You know, she had me around her finger, and I was, I think, just so taken in by her and in love with her from such an early age that it was never my instinct to be coddled or to be, you know, to be this sort of this person for whom someone needed to bake anything or go out of their way for anything. I was just excited to be along for the ride. And that really was our dynamic. It was her great enthusiasm for being with the little girl and my great enthusiasm for being with this fabulous woman. And so together, I would say both of our needs were met, and we had the world was our oyster, and our, you know, and occasionally our entire tea service.
You know, I love that about your writing, the way you really did focus on, as I said before, the flaws, her opinions, which she just was totally unfiltered. I wondered actually if you were as unfiltered as your grandmother.
No,
No, not going there.
My grandmother could silence a room. I'm there just like making sure everyone's okay and like don't want anyone to be uncomfortable. And
Sure. But you drew her so, she was so critical, she was so loving, she was marvelous, she was challenging. And as I was reading it and understanding that she and your mother really did have a very challenged relationship, and then when you came along, things really changed for both her and your mother and for you. But I was wondering, how did your mother, first of all, you had to go to your mother as like a primary source for some of this material. And then how did your mother respond to the book? And as you were writing it, and also the finished book, because you really, I mean, I think you did a beautiful job at not pretending anybody was anything other than who you experienced them to be and other people experienced them to be.
yeah, I mean, that really was a challenge of the book, which is I wanted to portray my grandmother as a figure, as a beloved figure, but I didn't want to sugarcoat her or do
Yes.
this sort of chicken soup for the grandmother's soul, or, you know, any kind of trite or cliche. version or caricature of her. I wanted to be real. And I think in order to love somebody, you do have to examine their flaws, and see her central flaws and I do believe her central flaw was in her relationship with her daughter, with my mom. And in seeing how she made mistakes, and some of them almost catastrophic mistakes. There's a chapter in the book called Pink Milk, which is one of the harder ones to read. And ultimately see this person who lived with great tension at times in her life, to understand how much of a relief it was for her to just have this loving embrace of a relationship. Without that, one really couldn't exist without the other. And my mom was, my most important, certainly my primary source. And as an editor and as a great writer, my mom was somebody who I leaned on a lot for questions of authenticity. And does this sound like grandma? Is this her? She was, completely integral to the process of writing this. And, she's my first acknowledgement, the whole thing. And then I write the manuscript. I've had all these conversations with her, conversations like, was it Georgie or was it Leo who was the one who got sick? Conversations like, what happened when grandpa got his professorship at Columbia? How did, what was behind that? All of the sort of nuts and bolts of things that happened before I was born. And I write it and I hit send to my mom, before to my editor. And, I sit there, and then about a week later, politely, we of course talk every day, Jewish mother, but a week later I asked her about it and I said, so have you gotten into the book at all? And she said, Bessie, I can't. Similar to your experience, like a paid for experience. She said, that's her. I can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I respected that until lawyers got involved. when the manuscript went to first draft, second draft, and then bound galley, my mom still hadn't read the book.
Oh my.
Penguin Random House called and said, we've done our legal read, and all of the questions are for your mother. So what would she say to these passages? And they highlighted like page 32, whatever. And not only did she not know the passages, she hadn't read anything in the book. And so I under what does a Jewish mother do? I said, Mom, I could get into serious legal trouble if you don't read this book. And she did read it, I guess under penalty of my jail. And she, you might hear a cameo from my 15-month-old son in the background. But she read it, and it was a very personal experience for her, and one that she could do her own talk, and certainly her own session with you about what's it like for your daughter to write as your mother about you, I'm sure is something that will take quite a few sessions to unpack. But she thanked me, and she should have known that it portrayed her in a sympathetic light, and that she was my source, so she made sure of that. But she thanked me for it, and I think it helped her. It helped her see her relationship with her mother from her least reliable source, from her daughter's eyes, which in a way, I think for her was a way to understand how she told the story of her own mother. And we've had a lot of conversations about my grandma and about the tough moments of her childhood that we never had before I wrote this book. And so I would say that it made my mom and I have a more honest relationship about the central figure in both of our lives, with whom we both had really different experiences. And because I wrote this book, we were able to find common ground and really talk about the woman, and not just the grandma or the mom, but to talk about her. And that's been really interesting.
I think that's one of the most important aspects of your book, Bess, for families. I think that being able to look at people outside of their primary role in which they are perceived it's a gift to the person, because when you do this, and maybe you were able to do this more openly, I don't know, because you got her voice, you understood her, because you kind of traveled the world for a bit, looking through her eyes and having her experiences, and then you could understand her. And I think once we are understanding of someone, we're much more likely to be able to forgive them, to look at them as a whole person. And I love the image of the two of you, your mother and yourself, looking at this woman, your grandmother, and each being able to kind of step out of the area where you had previously and only been. And I think that that's such a lesson for families, because we often pigeonhole people in our families because of, how they were our mother or how they were this. And we get stuck. We often get stuck. I think this would be, you mentioned page 32. You mentioned reading another passage.
Oh, yeah.
I would love to hear you read in your voice, which clearly is Bobby's voice, but it's also your voice. And if you don't mind doing that, it would be great.
Sure. Well, I have a part of the book, and this sounds like a sales pitch, but there's lots of pictures and lots of dialogue. It's a quick read. This is what I'm about to read actually does include my voice. It's a conversation between me and my grandma. And I think in telling her story and figuring out a way to put my grandmother into a book, there's certainly prose and there's longer passages and streams of consciousness, but there are also quite a few voicemails and conversations because our dynamic really comes through in the way that we spoke together. And so if you're following along, it's page 25 in your Haggadah. And it really does feel that way. And it is called Phone Call 2009. And you already know the way that the story ends because you heard the product of the story yelping my name in the other room. So we do have a son together is the end of the story, but here's how it began.
Yes.
Grandma, I'm going to Maine for Christmas to meet Charlie's family. To Maine? Yeah, that's where he grew up. I thought you said he went to boarding school. Right, but yes, the family lived in Maine. Well, they kicked him out. They didn't kick him out. It's just how they do things. His whole family went to that boarding school. Uh-huh. What? In this family, we don't send our children away. It wasn't like that at all. Bessie, what, Grandma? You will not send your children there, no matter what Charlie says. There are plenty of good schools where you don't have to abandon your child. Grandma, we have been dating for 3 months. I know. We don't even live together. You will. I don't know that. I do. Oh, really? How do you know? Because it's the middle of December and you're going to Maine. And so, she was always right. She really was. It's something that people say. She was not wrong. There would be times where I would disagree with her and I would do the opposite of what she says. There were times where I told her I was taking a taxi and I took the subway, but she was not wrong about that. She really called her shots, and that one she called pretty well. What I'm not showing you on my office floor is like 2 pacifiers and a learning block set. So she called it pretty well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know we're going to go to questions soon, but I want to ask you, I know some of the people who are on the call would really love to know a bit about your journey as a writer. And I know that your first book was Madeline at the Ballet, and I believe you penned that when you were in kindergarten. Is that correct?
That's right. You really have done amazing research.
Well, once I was able to dry my tears for long enough to be able to really follow what I knew was going to be something that would open my heart in my own healing, I share with you. Yeah. I just said, who is this young woman? And how has she captured so much about this intergenerational relationship with such poignancy and such love? So yes, I'm proud to say I was honored to do my research. So back to Madeline of the Ballet.
No, you're going to make me cry. You've
which I understand was a rhyming book, right?
Was, yes. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Dale. And by the way, my myself at 5 years old when I wrote this book would be utterly unfazed by me being interviewed by an illustrious woman about Madeline at the Ballet, because she would think that that is the pinnacle of my career too.
Of course. So your journey as a writer began with Madeline, and then obviously, and I'm jumping ahead. So you always knew you wanted to be a writer, from what I understand, and you wrote all the time, and you continue to write. So one of the things, I guess, is if you want to be a writer, write and take jobs from everybody. But you did something. You took a job, as I understand it, Wired, where you were like a fact checker.
I was.
Tell us, because that was kind of like a very important arc, right?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, with Madeline, and this is something that I've only realized after the fact, it's where I became a comedy writer. I was writing it as a serious book. And I was unintentionally writing a comedy. To plug Madeline one more time, which you cannot find on the Penguin Random House website, sadly, their loss. It ends with, so it's a story of Madeline becoming a major ballerina. Also my grandmother's influence. She's the one who I would see the ballet with. We would see Giselle and Swan Lake and Sleeping Beauty. And so it ended with, and then one day she was a star, and then she owned a salad bar. And
Pure
I
poetry.
mentioned growing up on 84th Street in Columbus, and there was a deli called the Parisian Deli, not Parisian, it was a bodega, and there was a salad bar there, and my parents would never they couldn't trust me to be, to fill my own thing at the salad. I don't think we ever got anything from that salad bar. So in my mind, it was like that was Mecca. And then one day she was a star, then she owned a salad bar is when I got my first huge laugh. And fast forward to Wired, that was a job that would pay me. I was a journalist. When I graduated from college, I got a job at GQ magazine, interviewing celebrities and writing, entertainment pieces, and it was a great job, but you're paid $1 a word, and which is actually great. But I needed a job with healthcare, and when my then boyfriend at the time, now father of baby, and husband, don't worry, and husband, everyone's like, no, yeah, he got a job in San Francisco in Mountain View, and I needed a job at the same publishing company as GQ to continue my 401k. I was making a practical decision, and Wired was also owned by Condé Nast. So I went into my Wired interview, and they said, and this is just how I sort of Forrest Gumped my way into a job at Wired. I am somebody who can barely figure out how to unmute myself on Zoom. I got in there, and they said, well, these cool guys, and they were like, well, what kind of camera do you use? And I said, oh, I just use my iPhone. And they all went, yes, exactly. Yes. Like that was like the perfect answer, because it was like right when the iPhone came out, and they were like, she knows that this is the cutting edge. And then they were basically like, you're writing samples and you seem to be extremely tech savvy, which they quickly were like, oh no, just put her on the things that don't matter. But on the fluff pieces. But yeah, I got a job checking other people's words at Wired as a fact checker. And I took it really seriously. I still think about I missed one thing in an article and somebody wrote in, and I think about it almost every day. And I'm thinking about it now, and I'm so sorry. It was a humbling and difficult, and in my mind, just because I was around writers, really exciting job. And I knew even if I wasn't, going to be given a column or allowed to write, I wanted to be around writing and around writers. And it was my grandmother who looked at me on Martha's Vineyard one summer where, I was stressing out about probably a similar article that I'm still stressing out about now. And she said, well, what are you doing? You're cleaning up other people's words. If you want to go be a writer, you go write. And I have her voice in my head still. And thank God I had somebody who looked at me and said, well, what do you want to do? And then another phrase, which comes up in the book and readers have really responded to, which is, what would a man do? And with that sort of push out of the comfort nest of having a desk job, I was able to take a risk on my own writing.
And isn't that when you started tweeting? Yes.
Are you ready to pivot to some questions? We've got
Absolutely. I'm so glad.
Oh, wow.
Well, you can tell us about the tweeting another time, but
okay.
Yes, thank you so much. And now we're going to open the audience. I know is clamoring because they have so many questions, and David's going to help us organize those.
Thanks. So I have a question from Harper in New York City. Finished your book this weekend. What was the process of putting all the pieces together, and how did you decide how to weave it the way you did with voicemails, phone calls, emails, etc.?
Well, thank you for that question, Harper. It was one of the hardest parts of writing the book, which was being done writing the book and then realizing it had to be a book. So I had this huge Word document on my computer, and in this sort of therapeutic way that Dale and I talked about, I would just sort of write my grief, and I would write the story that came to me, or the conversation that came to me, or voicemail that came to me. And so they were really all over the place just because I was going purely on instinct. And at the end of that process, once I had basically my word counts, once I had 250 pages, and I knew, and I had written the ending, which is how I knew I wanted to end the book. And fleshed out, each of the 4 central pieces, which is my mother, your mother, our life together, and after me. I then did what a TV writer does, which is I wrote down color-coded voicemail, story, or conversation, blue, yellow, and pink. And I put those 4 big sections, my mother, your mother, our life together after me, in white printer paper. And then I organized it on the floor of my parents' house in Rhode Island, where I wrote a lot of the book. I just organized it on the floor on this giant carpet. And I have a picture of it, which I'll send to somebody involved in maybe someone in the recap of this. I'll send it to Dale and then it'll go out. But I have a picture of, because it's like a crazy person. My mom walked in and was like, "Oh, there's my beautiful mind daughter." Because it truly looked like that. And I put it together in a way that all of the colors, it basically went yellow, blue, pink. And everything, what I saw emerge in front of me was everything was interlocking, that there would be a voicemail about Charlie and then a story about meeting my grandfather. And then it would sort of go into the real meaning of it, which was a voicemail about love. And, all of these things started, her life sort of started, and our life and her relationship with both of the other women in the story, her mom and my mom, came together in this puzzle on the floor. And it was like by 2 a.m. that night, I had it, took a picture of it, and I still have in this office somewhere in that cabinet the manila folder of those those index cards all together, because that is how I arranged the story.
Thank you.
So we have a question from Marjorie. I know Marjorie. She's a wonderful person with a very cute new puppy. And
Congratulations, Marjorie.
she asks, Bess, can we hear a real-time voicemail or 2 from Bobby?
Well, those are very, very personal, but I will say in the book, and I appreciate that yearning, and I have it too. Because it is my grandma, for me to listen to it is a whole other thing. Talking about her as a character and revealing myself is something that I actually feel really lucky to be able to do, because it's part of this project, is sharing her and connecting with people about her. But that's me doing her voice. Her doing her own voice is not something I have permission to do. And so keeping that as something between just the 2 of us. This sounds like a political answer, but I'm really just speaking off the cuff and being sincere, is something that might be too hard for me as a granddaughter, as much as it would be exciting for me as an author. And I do have to respect that. I do have a shred of that, even when I'm on camera doing an event, that the granddaughter in me does come first. And so to protect her, I'll keep her voicemails were meant for for me, and they'll stay that way. But because this is a Zoom, I can show you, if Marjorie, if you've read the book, then I can show you actually what my voicemails look like, which is a screenshot in this. And this is not something I'd be able to do if I were speaking at the JCC. It'd be too far away. So here are all of the voicemails in the book. You can see all of the landlines that she was calling from, all the way down to June 2012. And so, yes, that's what it looks like when your granddaughter can't delete a voicemail.
Thank you for showing that. I will share with you that I have my own voicemails of my mother, and I also have her phone. And every so often, I listen to the voicemails, her end, responding to people, because I still don't feel it's appropriate to listen to her private voicemails. So I think that what you're sharing is, this is a process. It has to do with memoir writing. And what you're able to take in and what you're able to reveal are different for different people. So David, I know we have another question.
We do. So Claudine wants to know, she says, your relationship with your grandma seems so exceptional. I think you mentioned she had 7 grandkids. Was your closeness unique among the grandkids? And I know the other 6 are not listening, so you can answer this honestly.
First of all, I love my cousin so much, and the my son is playing with his sorting blocks that one of my cousins got him for Hanukkah. That's why there has been minimal shouting, Mama. But my grandma had 7 grandchildren, and she loved each of them ferociously and equally. They're really, the expression "my pet" is something that she said, but it certainly was not my favorite. That's something very different. There was no favorite. This was my grandmother loved all of her grandchildren, and they each have their own "nobody will tell you this but me" about her. And there are stories that would overlap. I mean, my cousins and I have laughed about the same nudging, the same worrying, all of that. My grandmother and I had our relationship because of how she helped raise me, because of how my mom went back to work right when I was born, and my father was working too, and so my grandma really stepped in and was the one taking me to preschool and just filling a sort of super present role in my life from a very early age. And so we had that unique in proximity and time closeness, but that certainly is not a factor of magnitude of love. That's something that really can't be measured, and is something that is shared by all of her great grandchildren and grandchildren. And I think the book focuses necessarily on our relationship because it's my story to tell. It's I do not have license to tell their stories, nor would I. And it's also a matrilineal. This is the story of the only daughter of an only daughter of an only daughter. And so it is focusing on our specific vine of Jewish women in our family, of a great grandmother, grandmother, daughter, granddaughter, for that reason. So that's why the subject matter is what it is. And that's speaking to the great love that she had for so many people outside of me.
Great. So I have a question from Rochelle. She says, are you aware that your book was promoted enthusiastically by Nigella Lawson on Twitter? That was how I heard about it, read it, and loved it. Wondered if you found a sudden huge increase in your readership after her tweet. I know that I follow you on Twitter now, and I love your Twitter feed.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I mean, it's, that really, Dale hinted at it earlier, and, I think it probably leads to the gap between Wired and Jimmy Kimmel Live, where we've got to update the bio. I left the show in March because the book was optioned into a movie. And then I signed on to executive produce and be the head writer of a Amazon comedy special with Rachel Brosnahan and Sarah Silverman, which premieres on December 30th. On Amazon Prime. It's called Yearly Departed. But I got to Jimmy because of Twitter, and so it's sort of there's a 2-part thing. I'll address the Nigella is what I call her, my dear friend Nige. Oh my God, no, Ms. Lawson and Dame Lawson, whatever she deservedly goes by. But Jimmy, who is an excellent boss who I regret leaving every single day of my life, and is thanked in the book. It basically found me because of my tweets. I wrote jokes on Twitter, a website that has been horribly misused in the years since this has happened. And that's all I will say to that. But I really found it as this happy bastion at the time. As a fact checker, I was so buttoned up, and in this role where I had absolutely no creative license. In fact, it was my job to take away creative license from other people's work. And so I used it as this sort of, I'm speaking to Dale about this id release to sort of have, something to do with this, funny creative side that I privately had. And I would, it's weird to say that about oneself, but I would try to amuse my friends basically. And I had like 100 followers. They were all people who I would like see for beer later that night, and Charlie, who tolerated it. And that was what I was doing there until someone who knew someone who knew someone retweeted a joke. And then all of a sudden, all of these Letterman and SNL writers were following me. And then someone else did. And then all of a sudden, these Family Guy and Simpsons writers. And it was like this strange thing where I was the secret fact checker who was like doing social commentary on Twitter. And one day at Wired, I'll never forget, an editor who I was still am terrified of. He liked one of my tweets recently and I like wanted to hide. But he's brilliant. And I won't say his name here because I'm too scared, but he walked by my desk and went, "Funny stuff, Kalb," and kept walking. And I was like, do I have to submit my resignation? Am I like,
You've been found out.
Right. Am I fired? I like for some reason thought I was in trouble. And so eventually a fabulous mentor and writer named Nell Scovell, who is a former Letterman writer and Simpsons writer and also a Vanity Fair editor. So she sort of straddled both comedy and journalism, found my tweets and asked me to submit a packet to Kimmel through her agent. And that's the long and the short of it. So thank you for liking my Twitter. It's why I could buy this nice shade of blue for my office. And the Nigella tweet, I have a really fantastic publisher in the UK, Little Brown, and they've been so supportive of the book. And I've loved my editor there, Rose Tomaskawa in London. And it's such a great place for the book. And I'm so sad I can't travel there because I would love to. My grandmother loved London and Carnaby Street, and it even has a mention in the book. And I think she would be so excited to be the toast of the UK. Not really. I mean, in our mind, I'm sure if she knew what Nigella tweeting about it meant, she'd be very excited. And I've messaged with Ms. Lawson, and she's just so lovely. And I'm so grateful that anybody reads the book and that she used her platform to promote it is very special. And I'm very, very grateful.
So Pam, who I know to be a bubby herself, asks, does Bess have any advice for today's grandmothers?
That's like a magazine I would definitely subscribe to. Today's grandmothers, I am not somebody who is equipped or qualified to give advice about that. I know what it's like to be a granddaughter, but I have no idea what it's like. I barely know what it's like to be. I mean, I have 15 months of what it's like to be a mother, but ask me in 4 years what it's like to be the mother of a toddler. I don't have the experience to answer that, but I will say something that I loved as a granddaughter on the receiving end of a grandmother was somebody who took me seriously. And that was something that gave me a great sense of belonging and dignity around her. And so it wasn't about these fantastical trips to places that were inaccessible to the average, a Broadway show, a fancy tea. Those are the memories that sort of loom as these glinting places, but they're not about the love or the person. The love and the person came in quieter moments between the two of us and in conversations where it was just sort of the two of us, our personalities combining in a way that made us whole. And so I would say, listen to your grandchildren is something that is free and for me was so valuable. And the occasional lunch date doesn't hurt.
So I have a question from another Stacy in Connecticut. Connecticut is full of Stacys. Oh. And this Stacy says, thank you for sharing with us this evening. I'm working on a memoir, which is also born out of loss and grief. I'm struggling a bit with how some of what needs to be written, AKA my reality, may potentially upset some other family members. Yeah. Do you have some advice about how one might think about or navigate that?
I would say just cut yourself off from them. No, no. I mean, writing about other people is very tricky. And, I grew up both laughing uproariously to David Sedaris and being mortified about what his family must think. That was part of my experience reading his books. And I think that's part of what made them so funny, is that sort of schadenfreude of thinking about the family reading it. And so I didn't do that in this book. I really didn't take the pen to anybody to, condemn them or indict them. Certainly no living person, but Georgie and Leo might say otherwise. But I think out of respect, you sort of have to remember that at the end of the day, a book is a book, but family is family. And that sounds very trite, but it was my mantra doing this. Um, you have to be able to look at each other across the table. And so I would say nothing is as important as maintaining that relationship, not even a book. I think if these are stories that they're comfortable with you writing, and it's obviously such a case by case and sensitive thing, having an honest conversation with them about it and about why you're writing it, and what their take on the story would be is a really good first step. Um, and I think having interviews with my grandfather and interviews with my mother as part of this book helped broaden the scope of what I was writing about to really include different perspectives than my own and the narrative I was given by my grandma. So talking to them, being honest with them, and then just praying that they're okay with it. That's my advice.
Right. So Dale, I think I want to just have one more question from the audience, then I'll leave space in case you have a couple more follow-up questions.
Thank you, David.
At the end, here's a question from Molly Ann, who says, do you think your book is as well received, or I'll say differently received, by non-Jews as it is by Jews?
Yeah, so my first readers were all non-Jews, and that's something that was really important to me. My first reader, other than Charlie, poor Charlie, was my writing partner, my former writing partner at Kimmel, my friend Jeff Loveness, who's a brilliant writer. And Jeff is a Marvel Comics reading. He's actually writing the sequel to Ant-Man right now, which is so cool. Because he's like a child. He's like 29. But he's brilliant. We have none of the same interests. And he's, a big nerd. And unfortunately, he's my best friend. And Jeff was raised in a fundamentalist Christian community in Northern California. I know that's not what they call it. Northern California, and his parents were in their 40s when they had him, and so he never met his grandparents. And so that is the person who has the least in common with me. But I also trust him as a writer more than almost anybody. And so he read it and he cried. And he's so stoic, and I'm happy to say that in public and hope this gets reposted everywhere. But it was him saying, I have zero in common with any aspect of this book, and he loved it. And then the real reason this book came to be was because of my literary agent, Erin Malone, who is not Jewish and she's from Ohio. None of the places are familiar or the traditions are familiar to her. And she is who I sent the first 45 pages of what is now the first 45 pages of the book, all written in sort of one go. I sent them to her, and she was the one who told me this is a book. And so I think with them as my litmus test, I knew that this was not just a project that I would be able to share with people who had our experiences as Jews, but with other people, because I think the themes in the book are universal, that this is certainly a book about Judaism. It is, and about a Jewish lineage, but it's also about themes of love and resentment and need and death and grieving, and seeing it through a Jewish lens. I think it's important to have Jewish stories out there for non-Jews to sort of understand how awful we can be to each other as Jewish women in the same family, but to also understand how deeply culturally specific this book is and how pervasive our love and our families can be.
I really feel this is a love story. I must tell you that. And the people to whom I've recommended it are people of all different ages and all different cultural backgrounds. And the message comes through that anybody, it's kind of like My Big Fat Greek Wedding,
Yes.
appealed to so many people.
Totally.
Masala Wedding, all of these, one can see oneself in the relationships of mothers and daughters. And, people kind of switch the tradition, and they switch the accent, the immigrant story,
Yep.
the incredible drive, the 12-year-old great grandmother walking across from Pinsk to, to be able to get on a ship by herself,
Yeah.
not knowing a soul. I mean, people have these stories in their families and they relate to them. And I think to be able to understand the nuance of what it means to be in a relationship with someone who is human, who is not perfect, and whose love for you you never question, is really quite remarkable. I have 3 more questions, which I know we can't ask because of the webinar time, but I do want to say that there was one mantra in there that you said has been with you always. And I just want to share it because I think that each of us, to your point, each of us can really relate to it at some point. And it says, and maybe you can talk about it because I'd like to, perhaps you can end our conversation with what this means to you when your grandmother would say, when the earth is cracking behind your feet, you put one foot in front of the other and keep walking. And that was her mantra, your mantra. And I think that when you really visualize it and you understand that, in fact, perhaps for your great grandmother, that in fact was happening. The earth was cracking behind her feet as she was running to get out of Europe. And with your mother getting out of Brooklyn. And, I think that maybe you can just share with us, if you don't mind, Bess, how you've internalized that and what it means to you and how you use it as your mantra.
Yeah, I mean, that really is the single, especially in the past 8 or 9 months of being in this pandemic and being under lockdown and having this sort of specter of fear over us at all times. That mantra, that old adage that she would say that her Zader told her grandfather told her, it has gotten me through. It is such a powerful image to say when the earth is cracking your feet, put one foot in front of the other, but it's also an imperative rule to follow. Especially as a new mother, I have no choice but to go forward. And I think about that every time it feels too hard. And so I'm so grateful for my grandmother for repeating that ad nauseum and dealing with me as I rolled my eyes and said it back to her. I would cut her off midway through. I'd lose a soccer game and she'd go, when the earth is cracking behind your feet. And I go, I know, one foot in front of the other. But lately I've really invoked it to have the mental fortitude to just carry on. And I'm so grateful that it has reached so many people, because if there were something that she taught me, that it is the most helpful passage, I think, in the book. And it's something that I hope all readers and all people who come across this book are able to take with them, which is, when the earth is cracking behind your feet, you put one foot in front of the other and you go forward. Because honestly, and this is my editorializing, we don't have another choice.
Bess, I hope that the earth is kind to you as you go forward. Your book is magnificent. And on behalf of UJA and personally, and I just want to thank you for being available and being so open and sharing your grandmother, Bobby, and sharing your life with us, and wishing you all the best with everything that is in front of you, including, I understood, and maybe this can be the carrot, a book about camp. Oh my God, I found my own camp letters to my mother. So I can't wait to hear and to read your next book. But with all that you have on your plate, you have a lot going on. So good luck to you. And thank you for being a part of this program and making this program.
Dale, thank you so much. I have to say, this was an extraordinary interview, and I am so grateful for the time and thought that you put into reading the book and reflecting on it. This was a lovely conversation, and truly, you are free to bill me.
And Dale and Bess, I want to keep you on the screen because I really want to thank both of you for giving of your time and your wisdom to us tonight. Bess, I was particularly moved by your talking about making your family laugh at your grandmother's funeral in some way other than a Chuckles the Clown on Mary Tyler Moore kind of way. As someone who's been trying to reconcile whether it's okay to share good news and give people smiles during this difficult year, I've come to realize that it's the most important thing to do right now, is to share good news and give people reasons to smile. And so I'm so grateful for your teaching us that lesson and for actually doing that for us tonight. I want to once again thank our friends at the Westport Library, the Jewish Book Council, and especially our partners at UJA, JCC Greenwich, who helped us put this together. I want to thank you all for listening tonight and remind you as we come to the year end that there are plenty of people who need smiles, and that our federations are the conduit to help you give those smiles to others. So Dale, Bess, thank you so much. And everybody have a good night and a happy and especially healthy Hanukkah. Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.